Welcome to the next English episode of Architektura Powinna podcast. My name is Klaudia Lachcik, and besides working as an architect, I like to talk with interesting people about the cities, space, and architecture, just to be more and more conscious about our surrounding, about the space that influences our life and our well-being. You could think it's a Polish podcast only, but I can give you some heads up because my goal is to record more and more English episodes so we can have here a nice mixture of Polish and English conversations with fascinating guests from urban planning, architecture, and landscape field. If you like this idea, then don't hesitate to follow the podcast on Spotify and or Apple Podcast. You can rate the podcast on these platforms, which helps me a lot. But today we are going to talk about heritage and how we deal with it. I think we can all admit, well, we should at least, that old buildings physically link us to our past and become a part of our cultural heritage, which seems pretty logical that we should preserve something that has such a great value that is part of our identity. But usually, when we talk about heritage, it means that the building has a historical and cultural importance, a value. But what does it mean precisely? What kind of value does it bring? Why can we still transform or partially demolish some of the important monuments that are obviously part of heritage? Well, to answer these questions and more questions, I asked Karianne Vandenbroucke, my today guest. She is an architect specialized in heritage. She's a restoration architect, a heritage specialist at the Dutch office Rijnbouw. She's an author of the Dutch language book titled Mag dit weg? Can This Go Away? She's a board member at the Heritage Academie and had been teaching the heritage and design at TU Delft in the Netherlands. She completed her studies in Leuven in Belgium, and soon we'll hear a bit more. We will hear a bit more about that and following education as well. We talk about why Karianne became a restoration architect in the first place, and how shall we even call these mysterious people who are magically judging that what can be demolished and what should be preserved. How do we judge these values in architecture? How do designers show in their transformations what is old, what is new, and what type of interventions do we have? Is it a very judgmental profession? It feels so, at least. I mean, how much objectivism and subjectivism is there? The interesting question always, how young can the monument be? What is authenticity and how does it differ per country or per culture? Does this meaning change? We will talk a bit about Dutch approach towards heritage. For example, do you think that we preserve too much? Are we too preventive and protective? What are the consequences of such approach? When we talk about repurposing of existing structure and converting a building into a new function, we talk then about adaptive reuse. I read somewhere that, that's the quote, adaptive reuse is a conscious decision to preserve the past while planning for the future. Super smart. But it's not only about this dreamy idea, it's not only a sentimental effort to save a building, but it's also definitely a critical process to ensure that the part that is considered to be demolished really needs to be demolished, especially when the existing structure is valuable. It's a very interesting topic because adaptive reuse in the Netherlands increased a lot in recent years. There is a big demographic development which makes people move to the cities. There is a growing pressure on space. Therefore, it's definitely the topic that we should talk about to be more and more conscious about our fast changing surroundings. Adaptive reuse is also super in line with a global need for sustainability. Plus, there is an extra quality. the identity that was mentioned already, the identity that comes with the history. Amazing. There is a given story behind the building, inside the walls, that ensure this connection with the user. Therefore, dear listeners, let's listen to a conversation with Karianne Vandenbroucke. Yeah, before we start with the explanation of all of the terminology and dive deeper into the subject, I'm very curious about your personal story. How did you become the restoration architect? Is it a right name already? The first question, and a bit personal story.
Yeah. My background. Well,
Yeah.
When I studied architecture in Leuven, I studied architecture because I am Belgian, so I went to Belgium to Leuven to study. I was always more interested in architectural history. So the part, all the history part. And I know I had a lot of fellow students who really thought it was heavy stuff and I didn't like it. And I was always super interested and I did those exams very well. So when I had to choose a subject for graduation thesis, I chose a subject in architectural history. So it's a lot of archive work and work on the building, etc. So it was a very theoretical year. And after that year, I decided, yes, I'm still interested in the history of architecture, but I also do want to design. I want to do something hands-on, bring that history, give it a new future, not only study it to know so much about it, but also to do something with it. Because in my heart, I'm still an architect. I wanted to do both. And when I was in Leuven, there was the possibility after my master's to do an education which was called the Restoration and Conservation Master. So I decided to try that to see what it was like. And that was very much hands-on. So it was a lot of theory, but also we had to deliver a design in the end. So therefore, I used the term restoration architect myself for a very long time. And I think that's also in the Netherlands, restauratiearchitect is what most people would call it.
Mm-hmm. So that's a proper name.
But now more and more, I'm talking about heritage. I would call myself a heritage specialist. Because in a way, when you say restoration, it sounds a bit old-fashioned. Like if you're only working with like stuffy buildings decades ago.
Or maybe it's closer to reconstruction rather than
Yes.
also placing a new design.
Exactly. About the transformation, it's not there. Also, I know that in the municipalities, people speak about that they are the heritage counselor. So I use the word heritage a lot. And then just a couple of months ago, my boyfriend said, "Why do you always use this word heritage? Because it sounds so academic. You're very far from me when you say you work with heritage. I like when you say I work with monuments." So I was still a bit confused about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Again, the terminology. Then what is the difference?
Yeah. So the restoration architect, it sounds to me as a professional like I'm only working with old buildings, but maybe for most people it's very clear. It's better terminology than using the word heritage, which has to do with academic discussion on a very high level. But then when I was doing this postmasters, I saw a building which inspired me a lot, and it was Fort Napoleon, a fort on the Belgian coast, and it had been transformed into, let's say, a museum, but not really, because it was just itself. It was the building, and you could walk around with an audio tour. So it's not that there was things inside, but through the audio tour you heard the story of the building. And there was one intervention, there was a glass box, really big glass box, placed on one side where the restaurant was. And it really cut through the building. So it was quite intrusive intervention, because it made this big cut. But because of this glass box, when you were standing inside the box, it made this cut, it made this section of the building. So you could really see there was a high wall, there was a big moat, then there was the core of the fortress. So you could understand the fortress, when you stood in a glass box. And it's intervention that makes people understand the history without the audio tour. You could just see the history in front of you. You could see the meaning of the fortress, of the wall, of the moat, of the core. And it was just there in front of you. And that inspired me very much. That's the kind of architect I want to be. Is by my intervention, make people understand the meaning of the buildings, of the architecture, of the history. Even people who do not study for that, who do not know about architecture or history, they will just see the value and understand it.
That's very interesting that by this kind of intervention, you somehow protect the building because you deliver forward the lesson, the history, the story of this building, but the intervention itself, one might say it's quite radical, it's quite aggressive because you literally have to destroy some parts of the building, of the existing, maybe valuable tissue, but it's always this main question how far you can go in order to deliver even bigger value.
Yes.
Right? But to the questions about the heritage and the interventions, I feel like we're gonna reach this point in the conversation at one point anyway, because you mentioned when we talked about the topic of the questions sort of about this podcast, about our conversation, you mentioned that it's really difficult to explain what does it mean, for example, preservation, rehabilitation, reconstruction, why there is a problem, why there is no clear definition. I imagine it's not, maybe in English there is a definition, maybe in Dutch, in Polish would be a definition, but there is a problem with the translation then?
There is a problem with the translation, that in different languages the words have a different, not really meaning, but a different weight in a way. So that is one problem. And secondly, well, you have to go back. For me, in the field of heritage, terminology is very important. To use the right words, to use them the right way, blah, blah, blah. But people are talking endlessly, trying to define those terms very exactly. So every convention on heritage, every charter, every symposium starts with redefining the words. So in the end, we're only talking about the meaning of the words instead of using them and talking about the matter at hand. Therefore, I try to take a bit distance from all this terminology, because you can talk about this endlessly, but in the end, it's more important what you do.
So the intervention itself, that is really depending on the context, and the word itself will be explained by the intervention and the design.
Shall we call it a renovation, or shall we call it a transformation, or shall we call it conservation? Who cares?
Yeah, I even found rehabilitation about the heritage. I have no idea what does it mean.
Yes, there's so many words. A large part of it's because it gets lost in translation. But for me, in my daily work, I do try to be myself, to be precise in terminology. Because when I try to explain to people in the office or to people outside what I want to do, I think it's important to always use the same words, to not confuse other people. That if one day I talk about restoration and the other day I talk about renovation, they might think I mean something different. So I do try to be clear in that. And for me, for example, restoration is actually repairing damage. Okay, every building, every material deteriorates with age. And some materials will have an age of 20 years and need to be, need to be repaired, and other materials will live for 200 years, but every material has a lifespan. So at a certain point you need to repair it. And then you can just simply repair it, like you and I would do it. We just go to the shop and find some wood and find some glue, and we will repair things ourselves. That's not restoration. That's just simple repair.
Imitation, or that's
just repairing. But then, if you ask somebody who has really craftsmanship, who knows the types of wood, who knows the historical way of gluing, who knows the historical way of how things are constructed, and really does it in such a way that you don't see a difference. And not only that you don't see a difference, but that really there is no difference, then you call it restoration. And because it's the craftsmanship and the knowledge combined that makes the repairment as if it were original.
All right, but what if we have the situation that this piece is repaired with the form how it was, but differs in the material and the texture, in order to show that that we don't fake, that we don't imitate the history? Is it still a restoration?
Very strictly, it's not. Very strictly, it's.
What is it then?
Yeah, it's an imitation.
Imitate, okay.
Or a renovation.
Yeah.
Because you renew it. So the people are very pure at heart in this terminology would say, no, it's not restoration. There is indeed this idea that you always have to be honest with your public, that you have to show what is new and what is old. But in my reading of restoration, repairing it with the same craftsmanship in a way that's invisible, that's something you always have to do. Because material has a lifespan. When you do a transformation, so when you transform it to a new function, or you add something, well, transformation mostly is about changing the program, changing the function. Then you transform it to something new. There, for me, is a discussion, should you show what's old and what's new? You have the old building, but you add a new layer of use. And this new layer could be clear, readable, honest to your public. Okay, I added a new layer here. There never used to be a door here, or there never used to be stairs here, but we need them because of this new function. And there you can be very clear in your intervention with a new language.
So the moment if we start to talk about the repurposing of old building, so we have the adaptive reuse, so-called, then the doors are open. I mean, then the whole discussion is even broader, right?
Yes.
Then the restoration.
Restoration itself is a very technical thing. You have an old building, you want to preserve it, so you have to restore it. You have to repair damage of age. Sometimes it's damage of age. Sometimes it's damage because of bad use, because people did bad repairments in the past, and you can now see them. And they used the wrong kind of glue or the wrong kind of stone. And after a couple of years, you really start to see the difference. So you need to repair that. Or sometimes aesthetical repairments. When, for example, natural stone sculptures in a facade, they tear down because of the weather, and you want to bring them back. It's not technical damage, but it's aesthetical damage. It's still a valuable part of your monument. So you also need to repair it. You will always do it in a way that nobody sees the difference. And because that's the value of the facade, there has this beautiful stonework. And then if one day one piece breaks off simply because it's 500 years old, we'll glue it back in a way that nobody sees it.
I can place here then an example when we have a monument, an old building, piece of heritage that were transformed or a bit changed in the recent years, or a couple of years ago, and then we have a situation that it's not pure from one period of time. We have this another period, all the layers, and then doesn't mean we have now these different theories how we should treat it, or the answer it's probably that it really depends on the context. And
what you try to do is you try to evaluate each layer. When they did that, why did they do it? Was there technical reasons to make changes? Did the original architect really make a mistake? And the rain is always pouring in. They needed to add something to have a dry sitting room. I don't know. Is there a technical reason to make changes? Or a functional reason? The function changed? Or whatever. There can be different reasons why they needed to change it. And also the way in which they did it. And there is again this craftsmanship. If they just, without looking at the building, added some walls or some holes to make new doors and windows without any taste, any craftsmanship, any consideration for the original monument, then okay, I also don't have to have consideration for their work. But if they did it very precise, if they studied the project, they studied the monument, and they were very considerate and in their approach, then the result is more valuable because it takes into account the history and the values of the existing building. So it adds a valuable layer. And all those valuable layers you can take into account as well because they tell the story about how things changed over time with this building, how people thought differently about architecture. So it can be very valuable indeed to have all these layers.
But in order to judge these layers, there is a bit of subjectivism that it's in there, right?
Absolutely.
Can you say how much objectivism and subjectivism is in the judging this?
I think
these
it's
values?
Always subjective. Always.
Always.
It depends on so many things. The most famous example, there are two actually, two famous examples. One is, I think we all know it, that in the Romanesque churches, so the medieval churches that were in white stone, there were a lot of colorful paintings. And in the 19th century and early 20th century, people thought that it was silly to have colored paintings inside a church. So they took away all the colors. And afterwards they discovered that actually they were original. So it's just a matter of not having the right knowledge. And they did not know enough about history to be able to judge the colored paintings. So in many churches, these beautiful colors have disappeared. And now when we see churches, we think they should be white or gray or whatever, just natural stone. But actually most medieval churches were colorful inside.
Right now we don't have this connection. We don't think about the colorful
we don't
palette
know it anymore. But that was just a mistake in history, mistake in knowledge. And another one is also about color, actually. Maybe it's the same time. The late 19th century interiors were very colorful, very playful. Well, at least in the Netherlands, it was because actually economically the country was not doing very well from the late 18th till the early 19th century. So they could not build very much. And what they did is they only refurbish the rooms, and they have crazy color combinations. Like they had pink with yellow, the orange and green that maybe now think is from the 70s, but it was already then. They had all these different colors. They had very colorful painted ceilings, draperies inside, and it was just to make their house nice again because they couldn't afford to build a new house. So the interiors were redecorated in a very fancy way. And these especially 19th century interiors are demolished, many of them, because in the 20th century people thought it was just frivolous, it was just idiotic to have, because it was done in 18th century buildings. In the 19th century they were redecorated. So in the 20th century, oh no, we have to go back to the 18th century where everything was still styleful and charming, and it was still nice, and all this madness of the 19th century, we just have to take it out. So many interiors were lost. And now, at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st, we're really sorry.
Yeah, we're realizing that.
We're realizing it's a layer in history.
Yeah, that's something that currently, for example, in Polish heritage, there is a big discussion about the indeed 90s years and the monuments or not yet monuments, what to do with them, because the style of postmodernism, very colorful materials like pastel colors, not very expensive materials because of the 90s or 80s. Yeah, there is a huge spatial pressure on these buildings. There are not monuments in many cases, and there is a big threat of these monuments that are to be discovered probably in a few years. But it's a big danger the danger that countries and societies are facing, because there is always this question then how young the monument can be. It's always easy to say about ancient times. It's very clear about hundreds of years ago. But what about this newest heritage that we still have and they are quite close to be demolished? how young the monument can be. Is there a limit?
Well, I do think you do need some distance to be able to judge in time, distance in time.
Cannot imagine the new building
is being a monument.
Yes.
Some architects say that about themselves.
But that's ego.
But I think to really see, because it's about aesthetical, is it a beautiful building or not? But it's only one part. You only need to know, does it function well? Do the people like it? How is it used? But also the materials. Are they used in the right way? And do all the detailing work well, etc., etc. So it's how does it relate to the city? There's so much that you can only appreciate sometime after it was built.
Yes, the people are more connected with the building. There is a story behind it. It survived maybe some events, some time.
So I think there's like this. I think there's 50 years. I'm not sure. But in the Netherlands, it used to be 50
years. That's okay. Younger cannot be in the.
Cannot be now. Now they are making younger and younger monuments, but it used to be some rule that it need to be 50 years because then the people immediately evolved are not there. It will certainly be different in a generation to judge. What is difficult about young monuments is, well, the materials are different. Indeed, it's cheaper materials because we started to live differently after the Industrial Revolution. It's the materials themselves become cheaper. They become more flimsy. They become less valuable, the material itself, because it can just be produced and produced and produced. There's hundreds of that. There's thousands of that. The same.
Yeah.
And also, labor became very expensive. So the craftsmanship got lost. And there's less craftsmanship. Everything needs to be fast and easy to fix and easy to make.
Easy to assemble.
Yes. So the quality of the building was less for a very long time. I think now the quality of the building is rising, at least the way of constructing. And we're not talking about the quality of the architecture, but really the build quality is better now because we start to realize that most buildings stand there for a long time. In the 60s and the 70s, we thought that buildings would only last for 20, 30 years. So we only build them for quality 20, 30 years. So that's one problem, that the quality is really less. So if you want to protect them, it's really difficult. It costs you a lot of money to restore and to do the technical reparation of buildings with bad materials and bad detailing. So that the technical aspect is very difficult. What is also difficult is that actually the layers of time that we spoke about earlier. When you have very young monuments, there is no layers of time. There is just this one thing and everything is original. So everything you touch the original building, the original material, the original work of the architect, the original expression. There is no gray zone in which you as an architect can move, which very old ancient buildings, they have so many layers, and there's always one layer that has really no value at all that you can just take out, and there is some space, there's some gray area, and if you add your own layer, it's just another layer, and somebody else, the next architect in 40 years, can decide to either take it out or work with it. So old monuments in that way are easier to work with.
Yeah, it's easier. It's way easier to judge when you have the time that passed, and then immediately it gains points in the couple of values, right?
Yes.
In the rareness, I don't know. The current building, modern building, how rare it is right now. No, it's quite repetitive.
Yes.
So this value is gone. What other values do we judge? Shall we judge when talking about preserving buildings?
So there's two main values, and that's if it was the first time we did, for example, in Nagelen, it is a small town in the Netherlands, in Flevoland, there was a new idea of living. So the traditional Dutch house was abandoned, and there was a new Dutch house with a living room next to the street with very big windows that would go all the way to the garden with also very big windows. A see-through house, the doorzonwoning in Dutch. You can see all the way through and all the sunshine can come in. And it's actually now, most Dutch houses look like that now. But then it was the first. So when you go there and you don't know anything about the history of building, you say, well, this is a neighborhood like every other neighborhood in the Netherlands. Everything is built like this. Yes, but this is the first.
Exactly.
Here is where they invented it. So therefore you need to preserve it. Even if you don't like the topology, even if it's an ugly house, whatever.
Doesn't matter. The story matters, and
Exactly.
the fact that
Yes.
it was first.
So that's one, when it's the first, when there the idea was born, or when it's a very good example of the ordinary. Something that was repeated 1,000 times, but this is the best example, then let's save it.
Then a lot of row houses in the Netherlands have a chance to be preserved as
just one, not all of them, but just okay, let's save this one, and then all the others can go, but we have this one example in the history of architecture.
As a restoration architect, what is the most common question that other designers, for example, ask you?
To me,
can we destroy it?
Yes, can we destroy it? Yes. Can I make a hole? Can I destroy it? Like even today, I had a question of a colleague who said, we want to make some holes in that wall. It's all part of the monument, is it? I'm like, no, everything is always part of the monument. That particular wall might not carry value. And so you need to decide, what are the core values? Why do we preserve this specific monument? Mm-hmm. And then you can judge, okay, that specific wall, does it carry those values?
So your answer is never yes or no?
No. I always ask all the questions back. So you have to judge for yourself. If this wall is valuable for your core values.
And what about the authenticity? That's something that is connected to the layers again that we talked about. But then if we have more and more layers, then the question about the authenticity is even more complicated. Yes. What is really the core of it?
There is different views on authenticity. What you're talking about is a very, very Western view. You talk about authenticity of material. What is the original material? And in the tradition of heritage in the west of Europe, we care about the original material because we care about the craftsmanship. We want to really touch the material that the original craftsman has touched and has formed, and we like that it's a little bit dirty and that there's the scratches from all the people who touched it over time, and there's all this romantic idea about this original material. But in other parts of the world, and especially in Asia, authenticity is more about the sense of place. So they say a temple, for example, because it's a wood structure, it needs to be rebuilt every 40 years maybe, because the wood deteriorates in a tropical climate. But they say if it's done in exactly the same way, the same craftsmanship, the same wood, in the same place, etc., it ticks a couple of boxes. They say it's authentic because it's the same thing, and that's more authenticity of place, of atmosphere. That's sometimes difficult to explain. People say, no, it's in your building. It was built 20 years ago. Come on, it's not authentic in the sense of the authenticity of material. But actually, in the West, we do have these kind of stories the same. For example, pilgrimages, when there is a saint, and there's a church, and there is like a piece of the finger of Saint blah blah. There are some saints that should have had 20 fingers if you collect all the pieces in all the different churches, but there's a story that this piece of this little bone was Saint such and so. So people go there, people pray, and it's authentic. For them, it's authentic. For them, it's real. And they don't care whether, if I tell the scientific fact that if you collect all the bones in the world, that this person would have had 4 hands, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It's about the belief. And
it's about the belief, it's about the story, it's about the sense. And in that moment, in that time, it's true.
To understand it even better, it's the story about the reconstruction of the Warsaw Oldstown. That, of course, a lot of people might say that it's fake. It was just rebuilt after the Warsaw uprising, after Second World War. It now it's just fake. It's not really from before the war, but it can be considered as pretty authentic because it was also just the natural movement of the society that they, even before the project, before the design, they just rushed there to rebuild it themselves because it was the atmosphere that was missing. It was like the fundaments of the city that was missing, hence the fundaments of their own stability.
And I think a very important point in that story is that it was the people themselves, that they needed their history to be there.
Yeah.
And whether it was the real history, the proper stone, doesn't even matter. The prospect, the presence of their identity, especially after big events like a war, you need to know, where do I live? Where do I come from? What is my identity? You need to rebuild.
Yeah, that the story continues. The story needs to continue because I guess that's also one of the very important points of protecting the heritage, but at the same time also transform it. From your perspective, do you think that transforming and adaptive reuse in the Netherlands is quite, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but
invasive?
Yes, in terms of European adaptive reuse.
Well, it depends. Some countries are on the front. For example, in Catalonia, they're also quite progressive in a way, but maybe that's just my personal opinion. In the older countries, they are more preservative, like Italy, France, some parts of Germany. They're very conservative.
Yeah.
They're really preserving as it was, and it's very difficult to change, etc., etc. In the Netherlands, it's the opposite. Like every architect needs to add a new layer. And if you have a project and somebody says, oh, you can't even really see what changed, and people feel that they failed. And they say, oh no, you cannot see my intervention. Well, actually, it could also be a compliment. Like the intervention was so successful, then it's a natural adaptation.
It doesn't need to be always this huge contrast, right? There are some other ways to interfere with the heritage, not necessarily with the huge change, dramatic change.
I think a lot of architects in the Netherlands, up till recently, they thought that making a contrast was the only possible way to deal with heritage, because they wanted to have their own signature on the building, of course, and also because in a way it's an easy way to deal with heritage. You don't have to have an opinion about the heritage.
Yeah.
You just place some alien inside, and that's your new layer, and then you say, well, at least it's clear now what's old and what's new. But it's not always the most successful intervention, because the new part then has nothing to do with the old building. So if in 20 years' time, in 40 years' time, they need a new transformation, they will just take it out because it has nothing to do, it doesn't add any value.
A bit like a port in Antwerp by Zaha Hadid.
Yes.
That's very contrasting part that was added. The Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. It's also very easy to name all of these buildings because they are just so recognizable. Yes,
they're iconic and they get a lot of attention, and some of them are done very well, but I don't think they could last as long as a very intelligent. Well, a contrast can work. A contrast, you need to know that it catches the eye. When you make a contrast, you immediately draw attention to that particular part. It also means you take away the attention from the rest of the building. So if in a very old facade you need to make one new door, I would not make a contrast. Because if you make a big contrasting door, then everybody will only look at the door and the whole facade is gone. And if you want to restore a building, you need to restore it as a whole. But a contrast can be nice if you want to guide people. If, for example, the entrance is not very clear, you make a contrasting entrance then because you want people to go there. Or if people in the building need to go upstairs, or you want them to look upstairs because there's a beautiful ceiling and nobody ever looks up. You can have a very contrasting lights, for example, so people are surprised, they look at the lights and then they see the beautiful ceiling. So you can use the contrast, but you need to know that it is a tool.
Or what are the consequences out of it? From the other hand, this contrast can actually make people look at the building in general, because maybe for you it's obvious that everyone must look at this Baroque Renaissance facade, but maybe that's not that clear for every inhabitant.
Yes. No, like the example that I used at first for the Fort Napoleon in Belgium.
Mhm.
Yeah, that the glass box is a huge contrast, but it makes you understand the building. It makes you look at this section and realize, oh my god, this is a really interesting section.
Yeah.
Even if you're not an architect, you see it. So it can be useful, but it must be used in an intelligent way.
Okay, so then what other interventions do we have?
We can copy, just what is there, make the same.
Oh, that's also tricky. That seems like quite easy, but I feel like the architecture world can be very judgmental about, because that's very close to imitation, faking.
And that also depends what you want to reach. Like if you want to have an extra set of windows, and there were 8 windows, you want 9. Do you need to make it modern? Like I say, then all the attention will go to that one window. And you want the attention to go to the entrance or to the whole facade. So if you make another window, why not just copy the rest and make a balanced and quiet intervention so that the attention stays in the whole facade? Or if you need to add a little fence on the side, do you want a modern contrasting fence, or are you going to just take one of the fences that are there? And when it's a small adjustment that doesn't need any attention at all,
it doesn't need to scream.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can try to make contact. Like it's a bit of a contrast, but it's that your intervention, it's different when you stand up close. You see, okay, there's an intervention, this is new material, but when you're from far away, you would not necessarily see it.
It feels like a bit more complicated and challenging job for the designers to do.
Yes, because you need to find that balance. So that from far away, it looks natural, but up close, it's different. Where is that? Is it in the depth? Is it in the material? Is it in the detail? Is it in the color? What element are you going to change to not make it a copy, to make it something new, but still be part of the whole? Sometimes it can also be something totally different. In Amsterdam, what happens a lot if the people add an extra floor, an extra etage on top of a building. And there, of course, you cannot just copy the facade, because then it loses proportion. If you would just add another layer, that is exactly the same, it looks funny. So you need to add a layer with new architecture. And you can do that as a contrast. You can make a screaming facade, but then, like I said, the attention of the old facade will be lost. So you do want the extra layer to be different, but you also don't want it to have all the attention. It needs to be natural. It needs that the passerby doesn't even look up. So then you can make it look like, you can copy, you can make it look like a roof, for example. Or you can use a roof-like material, use some of the rhythm of the existing facade, but not all. Use the same size of the windows, but not exactly. So you can sort of make a connection between the old and the new without copying it.
So contact and connection, that's the third option of the intervention.
Well, the connection I think is even more than contact. Is just they can live together, but they're not family. When you make a connection, it's really family. It's the old and the new.
But without copying and imitating and faking. So we don't fall all the way there. No. We still are different. In this recognition.
It's really difficult to make that one. It's like a brother and a sister. Yeah. You know, they're related. You can really say, oh, you must be the sister of blah, blah. I know, because you have the same hair, you have the same eyes, the same way of looking. But still, nobody would think you are that. If you're not exact twins, they will see you're a different person. They know your family. That is the best, usually the most successful interventions, because they belong together as a brother and a sister, the old and the new. They have the same rhythm, the same characteristics, maybe even use the same material. But you can see immediately, okay, no, they're different. But that's really difficult to find that balance as an architect.
Yeah, that's very fascinating as well. But then in the end, we then have the copying, so imitating. We have a contrast all the way completely. And then we have two interventions that are sort of in the middle, that it's contact and that it's connection, which are the most challenging and the most interesting, probably. So then if I would have a couple of spare millions and I would buy a historical canal house in Amsterdam and I would like to make some extension, then what is the procedure in like very fast description? Who's gonna judge it and how the municipality might look at my design?
It's really difficult. In the Netherlands, it's really complicated because the house is your private property, but the status of a monument, being listed as a monument, means it has national value for the history of the nation. So many people have the right to say something about it. And for example, in Amsterdam, there's the Municipal Office of Monuments and Sites, Monuments and Archaeology, and they're very good. They're very professional. It's a big office because there's so many monuments in Amsterdam. So it's a big office. They do research very well. They come and really see the people, really come to your house to see to understand what's important, to explain to you what is important and how to deal with it. But for example, in Amsterdam, the whole sustainability question in monuments is quite difficult.
In what terms?
Well, to make a monument sustainable, to add insulation, to add double glazing, to have more ventilation going through the roof, etc., etc. In Amsterdam, they're very strict about that. They say, no, it's a monument, you cannot touch it. While other parts of the country, they're more easy about that. They say, okay, you can have solar panels on your roof, you can add double glazing if you really want to, etc. So per municipality, it's different.
It really depends then, because the adaptive reuse itself, that sounds like very sustainable idea, basically. Meanwhile, we have a huge spatial pressure in the Netherlands as a very small country, quite densely populated, people moving into the cities, right? There is a pressure to use the structure that we already have, and that's the idea. That sounds very sustainable
already. Yes, to reuse old structures in a good way.
And usually the most interesting projects are when this old structure has also some values that we don't use as structure, whatever, to adapt it to a new function, but there is an older building, maybe monumental building, that we want to readapt.
Yes, but it's really a question of comfort. We don't like to live in old monuments anymore. We think they're drafty and cold in the winter, and we think they overheat in summer. And we want running tap water on all the floors.
No mice.
No mice. So we ourselves are quite spoiled ourselves in how we want to live, how we want to use the building.
But then, does it influence this progressive approach of Dutch inhabitants then? And the pressure on municipalities, of course.
Yes, because when you want to make a monument, like the older way, we're talking about the canal house, the 17th, 18th century houses.
That's probably not much to do with that.
No, they're really difficult energetically to make them fit our
requirement
standards, and very difficult to adapt them without touching the original structure.
At the same time, I've heard that the head of central government monument care once said that there is nothing as changeable as a monument. That's interesting statement from such an institution. Like, how shall we understand these words, that there is nothing as changeable as a monument?
I think what they mean, that they're mostly talking about the old monuments. The fact that they survived is because they could have several functions. If a building is built for really one function only and that function disappears, then you only have an empty shell with no use at all. But the monuments that survived, they found a new function. So they were adaptive, they were flexible. That is a whole fashionable word of we have to have flexible buildings. The old monuments actually are flexible. Otherwise, they would not have survived up till now. like the big industrial halls that we are changing into creative hotspots, or the canal houses that were changed into offices, high rank offices. There is the post offices and the train stations that are changed to hotels. And they find new uses for these buildings.
But then doesn't mean function follows the form.
Yes. No, absolutely. You have to adjust your demands. I think what this person you quoted was talking about is that most monuments which survived for hundreds of years, they turned out to be adaptable.
I also think that the adaptive reuse really opens a lot of new doors and perspectives for the designers. Suddenly, a prison that becomes a housing, a real estate development, you have to answer the question how you can adapt the old, cheese warehouse into the housing, right?
Yes.
Or the churches into the library or the housing as well. But at the same time, we have hundreds of the requirements that these functions have to meet, and we have the not only technical but also like social or economic. That's the big challenge for the designers.
Yeah, I think it inspires creativity. When we talk about creativity, we see the architect as an artist who makes this big gesture on a white sheet, but to actually to work with what you have and have that whole building meet all the requirements and all the new uses, it's a different way of creativity. You have to work within a very tight framework. You have to find all the solutions.
Sometimes the limitation on the sketching paper it's actually a additional challenge.
Yes.
Maybe then the restoration architects and the transformation architects, they also have the ego a bit lower and they're more humble because this is the structure is already given and the question is what do I do with that? How much the new function of the building matters? Is it really building changing factor of the if we are talking about adaptation and transformation?
Well, it depends. What I experienced is that in the end, functions which resemble the original functions, they fit best. When you are designing for heritage, you're trying to fit the program in the existing building. And the end result, a good design, makes the building shine and the program work wonderfully. So that nobody will ever question why this match was made between this building and that program. But it looks like it was designed for this specific purpose. So first of all, you need to know your heritage very well. You need to know, okay, what are my core values? So you can decide indeed which wall can I tear down without losing my core values. Where is the gray area that I can work in? You need to know what problems the building has already on beforehand. What are the strong points? Are there some beautiful rooms or very good entrance? What are the weak points of the building? Anyway, regardless of the function, maybe the back facade is really ugly or closed down, or because of history there are very few toilets or whatever. And so there is always some strengths and weaknesses of the building, regardless of the function. Then you look at the program. You say, okay, this is the program that I want. Does it resemble the original function? Yes or no? And what aspects it does? How does it support these core values? Does it match the core values or not? So where does it fit? Why is this the best function for this building? Because it needs those beautiful rooms, or because it needs this very imposing entrance. But then there will also be parts where it doesn't fit.
But what about the question like how accessible the function should be for the others? Because especially in the part when we are talking about the heritage, so definitely the building that has social value, then this is a very important decision, I guess, taken by the governmental side, municipality side, what kind of function is going to be there, because maybe these monumental building become very close. If it's a private housing, then only these inhabitants, these people are going to experience all of these values that the building brings. then the question is how accessible is the museum, because museum is also just for a limited number of people that would go.
Yes. Well, if you go back to the Canal House, it's actually a very private function. But it was originally private function. If it survived because it became a notary office or a legal office, I don't know. It's also very private. So if nowadays somebody would buy it and it will keep it private, it's okay. Same for many other buildings. You don't have to open it up for the public to preserve it. But then, of course, it's a question then why to preserve it? And why do we need it if nobody can see it? But I think it's also because of the future. If somebody now can afford it, to restore it totally, but they say, I want to live in it, well, that's maybe for 10 or 20 years or 30. And then it will change again. And then at least it's preserved for this period.
Plus, maybe for Amsterdam is also quite understandable that it's not possible to make all the canal houses somehow open and accessible. There is Amsterdam Museum that it is located in 3-4 houses, and you can experience all of them. Somehow this balance of the private and public or civic ownership has to be well worked out in order to make the transformation in the city.
Yeah, in the Netherlands they organized a bit through subsidy. So if you want certain subsidies, and so there's a low subsidy just for maintenance, everybody can get it who owns a monument. But then there are some specific, quite higher subsidies. If you want to have them, you need to provide a plan of public entrance. And you can say, okay, so many days a year I will open up and I will have guided tours, or one of my rooms will always be museum or whatever. So if you have a plan how to open it up, it's easier to get certain subsidies because that's public money. That's government money. So
it's a nice balance then.
Yes, yeah.
I think without even asking the question why heritage matters, why is it important to preserve it and to I think all of our conversation and your answers really proved the point, why is it important. But then as a restoration architect, you are specialized in certain period of time?
Yes.
Yes, that wasn't very...
No, because that's when I came to Rijnmouw. It was really odd because I'm specialized in 17th and 18th century buildings.
And that specialization comes from the studies or from your preferences?
Yes, from coincidence, from what I worked on. Because before I worked on quite offices with a certain status. We worked on the proper old-fashioned monuments that were to become a museum, that were to become municipality owned. So the classical, that's more the better word, the classical office working on classical architecture. So I was used very much to that. And I came to Erfgoed because I wanted to do something different. And here it's all modern architecture. Well, for me, modern is after the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, that's good to to make it clear.
That's for many.
That's for restoration architects, very modern.
Yes, after 18. Good to know. Yes. So it's all young monuments that I work on now, and I find it, and especially in the beginning, I found it really challenging. And still now, today, I was visiting a monument which is very young, from the 70s, and we were talking very technical details about the brickwork. And I don't know so much about brickwork in the 70s. I know a lot about brickwork in the 17th and 18th century. I could immediately read it, understand it. But I was standing there and I thought, I know some of it, but not the same in-depth knowledge.
It's impossible to go so much into details through so many centuries.
Yeah, so I think a large part of the profession is experience. And that's why it's difficult to teach about heritage. Because, there's a certain methodology, how to approach a project, how to design with heritage, how to work, how to get your permit, etc., etc. But the technical part, the craftsmanship part, that is experience. You just need to work so and so many years to know about a certain subject.
That's interesting. Do you see any difference in approach of the designers, professional designers that you work with and the students that you used to work with?
Yes, I think the students, they demolish more. No, they're more afraid to touch anything. They're like, oh no, it's on a monument, you cannot touch it.
And then you open the gate,
Yes,
and then they
and
want
then
to
I
do
just show them some projects where like half of the building is gone, and I still like the project. And like, oh, you can really do that with heritage. And I just go wild. Oh, before you said the importance of preserving heritage, and I don't think we need to preserve everything. I think at this moment, actually, we're preserving too much. Because if you want a city, one of the characteristics of a city is that things happen there. You can make everything possible. That's why people from the countryside move to the city, because it's new, it's modern, the things happen there first. But then, if you're going to put a glass box over your city and say, okay, it's all monuments, we cannot change it anymore, then where are the fun stuff happening? And that's happening now. It's all the industrial places around the city. That's becoming creative zones where people like to go because it's still raw and it's exciting and there's creative industry and there's new concepts starting up and new startup businesses.
If it's more preserved, then there is no flexibility for new to happen. Yeah, that's very interesting.
It's also polished. So I think when you preserve something, it needs to have a purpose also for the new city, for the today's city. It's not only preserving and transforming, does not only have to do with the past and with preserving, it has very much to do with the future.
Preserving through development.
Yes.
And it has a lot of truth in it. With the transformation, you actually really preserve, even though it's going to be partially transformed, destroyed, just changed, but still the continuity of the function, of the liveness that the place keeps
more than
matters.
That. When you say preservation through transformation, there's still an emphasis on the preservation that you want to preserve. But I say there should be more emphasis on, okay, why am I taking this to the future? What is the new function going to be? How is it going to help the city to be better, to grow, to have people more happy? Well, for me, one of the things to preserve is, for example, identity, like we spoke about earlier. That people feel the identity where they come from. They like to shop in the old city center because it feels authentic. And we have to be careful not to lose the dynamics of the city. It's also part of its identity.
That's also important insight that you are giving, that the heritage and the preservation is, we might think that it's mostly about the material and the form itself and the building itself, but no, it might be about the atmosphere and the story that the building brings, not necessarily the form and the material. Maybe it's an urban plan, maybe it's a like broader perspective that needs to be preserved rather than material itself. I guess a very standard answer would be it depends on the context.
Yeah, that always works.
Probably. I can imagine it starts with that, your every answer for architects and designers. It really depends. Karianne, thank you very much for the conversation. It was honor, it was a big pleasure, and I hope the listeners also enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it very much. And now the topic of heritage and adaptive reuse is a bit more clear. But what I'm hoping even more for is that you're more interested in the process of dealing with heritage. And now, my dear listeners, I hope the next time you will see a transformation of a building on the street, you will ask yourself and judge truly, like, is it a copy? Is it a contrast? Very different addition, a very different modern extension. Is it a contact? There is this mutuality, but it's not the same. Or is it a connection? There's something about family relation. Do you remember? Personally, for sure, I will remember the words of Karianne that the clue of a good intervention is that it makes people understand the building and that it makes people to understand the meaning of the architecture. And that is the most beautiful. So let me know what you think about the talk and what are your thoughts about the thoughts on heritage and adaptive reuse. Check out also an Instagram profile of Architektura Powinna, and I see you in the next episode.